Okay, hello again, everyone. Welcome to the second session of today's workshop on motion event construal. I'd like to invite our first speaker this afternoon, Christina Piot, who's going to give us a talk on multimodal encoding of motion events in French and Dutch as L1 and L2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm going to present you the results of my master thesis today, which was on the multimodal encoding of motion events in French and Dutch as first and second language. So my study starts from two elements, which are motion events in speech, as we have mentioned it many times, and co-speech gestures. So the first part is based on the difference between verb-framed and satellite-framed languages, as observed by Talmy. And the differences we observe between French and Dutch are the same ones that we observe between English and Spanish. That is to say that in French, path is in the verb and manner in an adjunct, and in Dutch it's the opposite. So that would be the bird enters the cage flying. In French, l'oiseau rentre dans la cage en volant, whereas in Dutch it would be de vogel vliegt de kooi binnen. The bird flew into the cage. And in Dutch, there is also what is called posture verbs. So that these are verbs that are used to locate entities in space. And not only do they give the position of the object, but also how they are standing or sitting. So their posture, in other words. So in English, we would say the bottle is on the table. And in French, we would use a neutral verb such as to be, être, as well. So la bouteille est sur la table. But in Dutch, we would say how the bottle is on the table. So here staat. So the bottle is standing on the table. And then on the other hand, we have co-speech gestures. So these are the gestures we spontaneously produce while we are talking, the hand gestures. And several studies have shown that gestures are part of the communication process and that they play a role in both speech productions and speech perception. And other studies have also shown that gestures have both universal and language-specific characteristics. And these two elements come together in the fact that these differences would be a reflection of the typological differences we have between satellite and verb-framed languages. So I am going to give you a few elements of my theoretical background, and then I'll move on to the methods to finally discuss the results and conclude, and then I will explain to you what I'm going to do in the framework of my PhD project. So for the linguistic analysis, I used two taxonomies mainly. So the first one is a taxonomy elaborated by Kopeka, which concerns French verbs. So French is a verb-framed language, but there are still verbs which express manner and sometimes a combination of both. So we can see that some verbs express manner on their own, like voler, to fly, for example. But sometimes it's a prefix that expresses path and the stem of the verb, the manner. So we have different categories. So I use that to classify the verbs that I found in my data. And then for the locative location events, I used the taxonomies elaborated by Lemons and Perez with which contain, posture verbs, neutral verbs, and transitive verbs. So that these are the verbs that I use to describe location events. And then for the analysis of gestures, I based the analysis first on the taxonomy elaborated by McNeill with the dimensions that are present in the gestures. So for example, metaphoric gestures are used to depict an abstract concept, deictic to locate entities, but here I actually coded the location in the iconic, as I will explain later on. And then beats that I use to give rhythm, to indicate the rhythm of the speech, and pragmatic gestures, which are used to express feelings or uncertainty. And then the iconic gestures, which are the most interesting here, these are the gestures that depict a concrete entity or an action. So the purpose of my research was to determine which aspects are mentioned in speech, so in the verb and the satellites in the different languages, so French and Dutch, but also in Dutch as a second language. And then to determine the dimensions present in the co-speech gestures used by the participants to describe these events, and then the aspects present in the iconic gestures, so whether they express path or manner, sometimes both. And then I tried to see whether the aspects in gestures were complementary to the ones communicated in speech, and to determine whether learners were having a similar behavior to Dutch native speakers or whether they were still behaving as in French. And to conclude, I will observe my data and try to determine whether motion events control can be taught or restructured. So to answer these research questions, I conducted an experiment, which was divided into two parts. The first one was a retelling of video fragments that are fragments from the cartoon Tweety and Sylvester. So here you have an example. So this was an individual task. Participants had to retell me what they had just seen. And then the second part was a description of pictures. So here, there were like two participants. One of them had to memorize the spatial environments of an object for 30 seconds. And then he or she had to describe this spatial environment to their partner so that the partner could find the encircled object again. So this is the kind of images that I used. So in total, 18 people took part in this study. So there were 6 Dutch native speakers and then 12 French native speakers that did half of the experiment in Dutch and half in French. So that's why there are double participants. There are twice as many participants in French because they did half of the experiment in Dutch. And then I analyzed the data using ELAN, and I used the taxonomies that I mentioned before and other parameters that I won't have time to deal with today. And what are the results? So the first thing is that we can notice here is that the learners produced fewer utterances in the first experiment, but more gestures than in French. So they produced more utterances in French, but fewer gestures. And we can see that the Dutch native speakers produced more gestures and more utterances to describe the motion events. So in total, for the first experiment, I analyzed 1,800 gestures and 415 utterances. And then the second experiment was shorter. I don't know what happened. I just had an...
Sorry, Christina, I was admitting someone. It was my mistake.
Oh, okay. So
sorry.
No problem. So the numbers you see here are the average utterances of gestures per person in each group. And so in the second experiment, we see that there are fewer utterances and gestures, and learners produced as many utterances as in French, but then more gestures as in French, and the Dutch native speakers fewer utterances and gestures. So we move on to the expression of motion events in speech. So here we can see the aspects in the verbs in the first experiment, so the retelling of the video fragments. And we can observe that in Dutch, they tend to use manner verbs as in a satellite framed language, whereas in French it is less common and they tend to use more path verbs than Dutch speakers. And then we can see that learners are in between. That is to say that they still use past verbs, but like less frequently than in French, and they use more frequently manner verbs than in French and less frequent than in Dutch, but it's really close actually. The other thing that is important here is here we can see that Dutch speakers use verbs in which manner is encoded and path in the prefix. I will show you examples right away, right now. Whereas Dutch learners of Dutch, sorry, actually don't use this phenomenon. So that seems to be quite complicated to them. But then we can see that they also use verbs in which both path and manner are expressed in all the groups, and more in French than in Dutch. And then in the second one, so the location events, here the differences are quite striking. So in French, we use many neutral verbs, as we have seen. In Dutch, very few, and a lot of posture verbs. And learners seem to have many difficulties with posture verbs, as they only use them in 15% of cases, and they still use many neutral verbs. The only thing here that we see that they are going to behave as Dutch native speakers is in the way that they use other types of verb to describe location events as the Dutch native speakers, that is to say possession verbs and the perception verb, which are things that don't really occur in the French data. So here we have examples. So from a Dutch native speakers first, dus Tweety loopt weg. Dus loopt weg is like run away, uit de kooi. So here we see that we have manner in the verb and then path in the particle. And then here we have a posture verb saying that the bench is standing and on which there are two boys standing again. So we have many posture verbs in this sentence. And whereas in French, we have there is a lion on the boat, and the lion leaves the boat running. Here we have the path and then the manner. And then we have the data from the French-speaking learners of Dutch. Hij loopt. So here we have manner in the verb loopt. So he heen en terug. So that means he walks back and forth. So walk, we have the manner, and then back and forth, we have the path in a satellite. And then here we have to fly, verb in which manner is encoded. And here weggaan is like go away. So in this case, we have a verb in which the path is expressed in the particle. And here again, to describe a location events, there are two children. So zijn is to be. So it's a neutral verb. So we find the differences between language, verb framed and satellite frame languages here. And also the differences between the way French and Dutch speakers express location events. And we see that the learners are acquiring the structures of Dutch to describe dynamic motion events as they express them with manner verbs, but still they are having difficulties in using verbs in which manner is encoded in the stem and then path in the prefix, and they still underuse posture verbs. So what about gestures? So in the first experiments, we see that native speakers produce more often iconic gestures than learners. So we could think that producing iconic gestures in the second language seems difficult, but actually if we look at the absolute values, we see that the French speakers produce as many iconic gestures in French and in Dutch, and the difference is that they produce many more non-substantive gestures, so that is to say beats and pragmatic gestures, so to express uncertainty or feelings or to give rhythm to the speech, to indicate the rhythm of the speech, when they are talking in the target language than in French. And we also see that Dutch speakers produce many more gestures and a majority of iconic gestures as well. And then in the second experiment, the differences are less striking. So there are many of iconic gestures are more common in the learner group as well. They still produce non-substantive gestures, but less often than in the first experiment. And then if you look at the aspect in the iconic gestures, we see that French speakers are the one who encode path in their gestures the most often, and learners tend to do it in the same way. So the percentages are really close to each other, whereas in Dutch it is less common. Manner is not expressed as often as we could expect. Still a bit more by French speakers, followed by the learners and the Dutch speakers. But we see that the native speakers produce more gestures in which both manner and path are encoded, whereas it is a bit less common in the group of learners. And all of the participants produce depictions. So they depict things sometimes in a precise way and other times in a more approximative manner.
Christina, you have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this is basically a summary of what I've just said. So I'll show you an example now. So the learner had to describe this event of Sylvester who wants to pole vaulting to go and catch Tweety. So here she said, and then he's taking a piece of tree and she's depicting it. Sorry. And he wants to use it to run. So here she's like showing the manner in her gesture to run. And then she says that he wants to go above the piece of tree. And then she shows the way he's doing it. And then she says above the lake, and she shows the path. So this is a learner. And then if we look at speech and gestures together, we see that French speakers tend to encode the same piece in their gesture and is in the verb, followed by the satellite, and then to give extra information. Whereas Dutch speakers give the same information as in the satellite and then verb and satellite together, and then to give extra information. So here we have a difference again in the frequency. And the Dutch speakers encode the same pieces of information in the gesture as in the satellite, and then to give extra information, and then that in the verbs. So we see differences and similarities. So maybe we could talk about an intergesture system as there is the interlanguage. And here I will show you quickly an extract of a participant who is giving extra pieces of information in her gestures compared to speech. So here she says, and he drags. So we don't see the path of the movement, but we see how she holds, how the lion holds Sylvester. And here she says, and he holds it a bit above. And here we see both path and the way in which the lion holds Sylvester. So can motion events construed, be taught, or restructured? Well, I know that dynamic motion events had not been explicitly taught to learners. We see that they use frequently manner verbs, that they use manner verb frequently, but that they don't really use verbs in which the path is in the prefix and manner in the stem. And on the other hand, posture verbs had been explicitly taught to half of the participants. And from another analysis, I can tell you that there is no difference in their use, in the frequency of the use of posture verbs by the participant who had been taught and not been taught. So there are several points that could be talked about. So the degree of complexity, so the semantic network of posture verbs are really, really complicated. And it's more complicated to use verbs which are sometimes can be divided into two parts and sometimes not for French speakers. And then posture verbs is a category that does not exist in French. And as far as gestures are concerned, we see that the path is expressed as often in French as in Dutch L2 in the gestures, but maybe the form could show some differences, or the fact of boundary crossing as well. The amount of non-substantive gestures shows that it's different to use gestures in a second language. And maybe synchronization could teach us more things about the restructuration of motion events. So now I'm doing my PhD on a similar subject. So I'm still studying motion events in L1 and L2, but with the CLIL public. So pupils from the first form. So I'm also interested in seeing how the way they acquire language makes a difference. And I'm going to follow them the next 3 years. I'm going to study synchronization between speech and gestures and to do an analysis per motion events. And for this project, I'm also planning on adapting my methodology, refining it, using new taxonomies and new ways of analyzing speech and gestures in parallel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. That's great, perfect timing. I'd like some questions, please. I can see a few people applauding. Thank you very much. There aren't any questions in the chat box. Fribert, yes, please, you have a question.
Sorry, I was clapping. Sorry, I'm not asking so far a question. I think it's Renan.
Okay, right. Thank you, Renan. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Good. Really interesting research, Christina. I wanted to ask about the kinds of gestures they make. I'm not very familiar with gesture in motion, to be honest, but as far as I understood, both the different groups of speakers that you had, they all expressed more path gestures than manner ones, right? Would you say that that could be because a path is an obligatory component of motion framing, as opposed to a manner, which is not compulsory or not obligatory in motion lexicalization?
Christina, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. I was saying, so thank you first. And I wouldn't say path is always compulsory. Sometimes people produce sentences without mentioning path, like he starts to fly, for example. Maybe it's a way of conceptualizing things as well, like to give extra information when they trace path. Sometimes it's really a way they conceptualize the scene, and it's a way for them to show exactly what was going on, whereas manner gestures are sometimes a bit redundant. For example, I had a participant saying fly and doing this, whereas it doesn't really add much information. Like the one I showed you saying run, and she's doing this, it doesn't really add information as well. Sometimes it does, sometimes manner gestures occur, whereas there is no manner in the speech. I had a participant, for example, saying he's on the boat and doing this, showing that he was rowing, so that happens too. Whereas this verb exists in French and could have been used, I mean, some participants did it as well. So I don't know if it's because path is more common in speech. I couldn't say that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question from Janine. Would you like to ask your question, Janine?
Well, yeah, just to say this is a great presentation.
Thank
I
you.
was just I'm familiar a little bit with the work of Marianne Goldberg in this area, and
Mhm.
she, I think we discussed it when we were at
Yeah.
the poster together as well. That she showed when Dutch learners of French learn to express manner and caused motion in French, they transport or transfer their motion, the gestures that from their L1 to their L2. So in Dutch, you have these posture verbs that indicate the shape of the object that you're positioning. So if it's a bottle, you'd have this kind of rounded shape of your hand to put a bottle on the table. And in French, you don't have posture verbs. But
No.
if you ask them put the bottle on the table in French, then they would still use a Dutch shape to express manner of motion and the caused motion. So I was wondering if you have found any of that.
So I haven't really studied hand-shaped, but what I noticed is that sometimes manner is expressed in the gesture that we saw, the example with he holds Sylvester, and we see that he is holding him by the stirrup, whereas whereas she doesn't say it. And I have seen that in French too. So some French participants did it in French as well, without mentioning it in speech either. But I haven't studied hand shape in itself. So these are just things that I noticed because they were really striking, since that was what was going on in the video. But for example, in the second experiment, I didn't really pay attention to that. But that's something I'm going to look at in the future as well.
But it would be too simple to say that any gestures that we make are just compensatory, right? That's what we discussed earlier. That would be too simplistic, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to determine whether it's compensatory or not. Sometimes it's clear because the speaker says like this and shows how it's done. But when they are complementary, it's difficult to say that it's compensatory. It could just be another way of giving information.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, right, thank you. We have another question from Sabine Denot. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I know Julien Perez. I mean, I'm from Belgium, so we have been things together. Probably you know that. On one of your slides, you said, I'm sorry, you can't see me probably. I'm sorry. Just a minute. But on one of your slides, you claimed that dynamic motion events can't be taught. So I was a bit surprised about this.
Can be what? Sorry?
About that, in fact, dynamic motion events can't be taught. You can't.
No. I haven't said that they can't be taught. I said that they were not taught.
I mean, right. So I misunderstood it. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. No.
So as we had a class on posture verb, for example, like we learned about the semantic networks of the different posture verbs and how they were used, when, in which context, etc. That's not something that occurred with dynamic motion events. That's what I meant.
Okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood it then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've time for another question. If somebody would like to put their hand up or come forward. I can't see any hands up at the moment. Okay. Just a quick question from me. I wasn't, maybe I missed it, but I wasn't quite sure what level the learners were in your study.
So there are students in Germanic languages and literature at the University of Liège. So there were students from the second year and students from the last year. So we could say between upper intermediates and advanced, but they didn't take a language test. That's also something I'm doing now. So with my CLIL pupils, I had them take a language test before starting to have an objective idea of their level.
Right. So you didn't look at the level, even though they were from different years, nevertheless?
No, so they are all studying Dutch.
Oh,
so I based the division between like second year and last year students.
Okay, fine. Okay.
But here I didn't really make a distinction. I did it in my master thesis, but here, since there are only like 6 participants in each group doing half of the experiment, I just used like the etiquette learner, yeah.
Okay, well, that's marvelous. Well, thank you very much. I think
Thank you.
Thank you. A fascinating talk. Thank you. So applause from everybody if they can for a